Welcome back, Shop Rats. Today, here on Talk About It Tuesday, we're going to have a little bit of a tech talk. Today, we're going to just briefly touch on the connection and the disconnection between cylinder pressure and compression ratio. They don't necessarily equate. Let's just watch the show intro. We'll see you in about 27 seconds, and then we'll get into it. I'm Mike, and this is My Car's Shop.
Working out of a 100-year-old refurbished barn, bringing 35 years of experience to projects considered beyond repair. Vision, creativity, and problem solving are essential tools in this place. Watch as we transform junk into polished metal miracles. This is My Car's Shop.
I do find that it seems like the more information that is available, the more misinformation is available. And I'm certainly not going to claim any level of expertise here, but I have been building high-performance engines since sometime in the late 80s, so I have a bit of experience. Now, that experience doesn't mean that I have engineering level knowledge, but there are some basic things that I think maybe we can help clear the air up a little bit. And I know for a fact that there will be comments about this, both in favor and opposing, and that's fine. As Gene Simmons said, love us or hate us, we don't care. Hey, as long as you're paying attention. So that's good. But let's get into this a little bit. So, one of the things to understand about cylinder pressure is that it is dynamic and it is not the same at every RPM. There are many, many factors that go into that. One of them being, obviously, would be compression ratio, but compression ratio does not determine cylinder pressure. Let me say that one more time for those in the back who maybe didn't hear it. Compression ratio does not determine cylinder pressure. Well, you think, wait, what do you mean? Well, let's talk about what compression ratio is, because compression ratio is literally a mathematical factor. It is a physical thing. It is the volume of the cylinder with the piston at the bottom of the stroke versus the volume of the cylinder with the piston at the top of the stroke. So if there is 10 times more volume with the piston at bottom dead center than there is with the piston at top dead center, you would have a compression ratio of 10 to 1. Does that make sense? So if it was 8, it would be 8 to 1. If it was 12, it would be 12 to 1. So compression ratio, once again, is the volume of the cylinder with the piston at bottom dead center versus the volume of the cylinder with the piston at top dead center. That is a volumetric constant in an engine. There's no changing that as far as when the engine is together. Now, different heads can change that because of the chamber size, open chamber, closed chamber, that kind of stuff. But it is literally a volume that is unchanging when that engine is assembled. So truly, the only way to know how much pressure an engine is capable of building, take everything else out of the equation, the camshaft, the valves, all of that, just whatever the combustion chamber is with both valves closed, moving the piston from the very bottom and squeezing it to the very top, and measuring that would tell you how much pressure that cylinder is capable of generating. Now, we don't know what that would be. Probably somebody does. I don't. But the point is, that would be your static compression on the engine. Now, that's an engineering thing, okay? No engine does that without the valves opening, or there are probably big problems in that engine, and of course you're going to have things like ring failure and other stuff. But again, speaking from a strictly theoretical standpoint, that would be the maximum that particular engine could generate for cylinder pressure. Now, I see a lot of people asking questions out there. Well, I have an engine that's 10.5 to 1 compression. What's my cylinder pressure going to be? I don't know. Nobody does, okay? There are too many other factors, and that's what I want to get into today, talking about the dynamic of all of this in the real-world cylinder pressure versus what your compression ratio is. Now, I'm going to backpedal just a little bit on what I just said about, the maximum it can generate, because there is one factor that will affected, and that is how well your rings are sealing. Okay, so when I was saying that earlier, it was assuming a 100% piston ring seal. Now that's not really possible, but for the purposes of theory, that's what I was talking about. So the first thing that affects your compression, your cylinder pressure, are the piston rings. Are they sealing good? Are they strong? The condition of the cylinder, of course, as well, because there is that union between the rings against the cylinder and how well they seal. Okay, so that's the first thing that will affect your cylinder pressure. How much blow-by does that engine have? In other words, how much of that cylinder pressure is blowing by the rings and going down into the crankcase? Now, there's more to it than that, but let's just leave it at that for simplicity's sake, and then we'll complex it up as we go further forward. Another factor is how well are the valves sealing? Now, we would think that in a race engine or in a street high performance engine, we've had the heads gone through and the valves would have a good 3-angle valve job, and the valves would be seating real good against the seats in the head, and they would be leaking. Not at all. In the perfect world, that's true. Again, we don't live in a perfect world, but in general, most valve jobs will cause a real good seal. So, but that is a thing that can affect cylinder pressure, is how much compression, how much cylinder pressure is being leaked past both the intake and the exhaust valve. Another factor, and the higher the cylinder pressure goes, the more this can become a factor. Of course, in a situation of failure, it's an obvious factor, and that is how good is the head gasket sealing. That makes a difference. Is it an exact head gasket that fits the exact size of the cylinder, or like some, is it a little bigger and you're losing a little bit of that compression ratio because you're adding a little bit more volume to that cylinder by that gasket sealing ring on the head gasket being larger than the actual cylinder itself? Those things do affect cylinder pressure. So how good is the head gasket sealing? The other thing that is a part of this, and this goes back to compression ratio, but it affects cylinder pressure, how thick is that gasket? Is it a thin shim gasket that is decreasing that cylinder volume a fair bit, or is it a thick one that's decreasing it? I believe Tom Hoover used to say that a good steel shim gasket, don't quote me on this because I haven't talked to Tom, because he's dead, but I haven't talked to Tom in probably close to 25 years, so, you know. But I believe he used to say that going with a real thin shim head gasket could give you 1 or 2 points on your compression. So like if it was 10.5, you might, with a thin shim gasket, you might get 10.6. You would have to actually do the measurements, obviously, to know what that is, or at least be able to do the calculations. But the point is, head gasket thickness makes a difference. But it also makes a difference in how well it seals, because if your heads aren't perfectly flat and the deck of your block isn't perfectly flat, a thin shim steel gasket may not give you the seal that you need. But here's the one that most people overlook, and I kind of chuckle when I see people doing compression tests, particularly on high-performance engines, and they say, oh, the cylinder pressure's down across this. Well, part of the trade-off in a high-performance engine is getting as much cylinder pressure as possible, because the harder the squeeze, the bigger the bang. When you get your explosion, of course, that means you have to have higher octane fuels, and I think we did do a session on fuel octane at some point here, if I remember right, so you can go over to the Talk About It or the Tech Talk Tuesday playlist and find that and realize about what is mislabeled slow burning fuels and so forth. Yes, I do remember doing it. But the biggest factor in cylinder pressure does not change the compression ratio, okay? Camshaft. A stock engine has very little overlap, if any. Well, there's always a little teeny bit, but very little overlap between the intake and the exhaust. And so the amount of cylinder pressure that is bled off because of camshaft profiles can actually be quite significant. So when you're building a high-performance engine, one of the reasons why you would go to higher compression isn't just for the bang, but also to compensate for the lack of or the loss of cylinder pressure with a high-profile cam. You know, the reason that a high-performance cam lumps is because of the intake valve and the exhaust valve being open at the same time, and it's called backslugging the intake, which means that it's allowing a little bit of those exhaust gases at lower RPM to come back into the intake. I may have just misspoke myself there because I quite frankly haven't thought about this stuff, and I didn't take time to look it up. I haven't thought about this stuff in years, but I thought it would be a good discussion because I just saw a bunch of stuff out there about,
my engine's got 13.5 to 1, and, they're telling me that my cylinder pressure should be 275 psi, and I'm only getting 120, and I've obviously got big problems.
so how big's your cam? Okay, I'm being a smart aleck. I know I am. I'm exaggerating the numbers. I know I am. But cam profile is a huge factor. Cam timing is also a factor. The actual cylinder pressure. Now, what happens with cam is as the RPM goes up and as that event timing starts happening faster and faster with the piston coming up and the valves opening and closing, you're allowing more air to flow through the engine, which makes the engine make more power. So you have a combination of airflow through the engine. In other words, this is all about volumetric efficiency. The air-fuel ratio going through the engine, how much you can squeeze into that thing, and then how hard you can squeeze it, and then how much you can make it go boom! And remember, here's a tech tip from Mike.
The bigger the boom, the faster the vroom.
There may be other factors involved that I'm not thinking about right now, but these are definitely some things to think about. So if you put together an engine and it's got 10.5 to 1 pistons and you put a really good hot cam in there, and at crank, your cylinder pressure, cranking, remember we're talking about cranking like you would do your normal compression test, your cylinder pressure seems lower than you think it should be, take time to think about it. How many points do you think you should be at versus where you're at? How big is your cam? Those are all factors to consider. Another thing that we could talk about, and I used to do this when I worked in fuel system development and I did a lot of high-speed data logging, we did a lot of in-cylinder live with a running engine measured cylinder pressures. Now we were measuring more like combustion pressure and combustion temperature and stuff like that. But there is a way to check your dynamic cylinder pressure with your engine running and see where you're at specific RPM. I will caution you, there are a couple of things, and you can research this. It's out here on YouTube. I've seen videos about it. I would do it probably a little bit more complex if I was going to, and I would be drilling the heads and putting actual pressure transducers, and that's a high dollar way of doing it. But there's cheap and dirty by taking out a plug, screwing in a pressure transducer, and checking it that way when it's missing.
It's missing on one cylinder.
Rented lips today.
So there are definitely ways you can do that. A couple of cautions is you want to be careful about ring damage. You want to be careful about a lot of these more modern vehicles. You can ruin or destroy, especially coil pack. You can ruin a coil pack. So make sure that your plug wire is grounded, etc. That's not what this video is about, but I'll just throw those cautions out there. Believe me, there's a lot more to it than that. Now, it's not rocket science, okay? All this information is readily available, but make sure if you're going to go further with this that you go to a trusted and reliable source and do your research before you start testing things. Again, in conclusion, can I tell you that if you have an 11.5 to 1 compression engine with a cam that has 108 lobe centers with 510 lift and 312 degrees duration. That's a lot. I don't know. I'm just making it up. Can I tell you what your cylinder pressure should be at crank?
Nope.
Because there are too many factors. I always kind of chuckle when I see people throw a compression tester in and crank an engine over and say, oh, this engine only has 110 psi. Something's radically wrong with it. Well, do you know anything about the engine? It may not be. It may be okay because we don't know the cam profile, blah, 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 blah. So what I would say, my rule of thumb when I'm looking at an engine is how consistent is it across all 8 cylinders? Because the odds of the entire engine being low on compression in every cylinder equally, probably pretty slim. So if you have a bunch of cylinders that are 130 psi and you have one cylinder that's at 90, now you have something that says this is suspect. But my rule of if they're all within 5% ish, especially on an engine that's cold, you're probably okay. But again, You've got to do your research. All right, that's going to do it for this one. I appreciate you joining me on this
Talk About It Tech Tip Tuesday.
Talk About It Tech Tip Tuesday.
Appreciate you being here. We're over on the Face thing. We're over on Instant Grandma. She loves us. She gets us cookies and stuff. We're here on the You thing. Like, subscribe, all that stuff you're supposed to do. Spread the word about the channel. The greatest way you can help us grow is to tell other people about it.
Oh,
And one more thing.
It's important.
you don't want to forget. Rock!